I suppose we can get into the actual repertoire questions right now and see where things leads us. If you're fine with that.
Yep. Mhm.
Got to start with the the basic question I'm sure everybody that has ever interviewed or talked with you asks, but how did you get into ants?
So my story actually starts way back. So my mom grew up in very rural China, and she was really afraid of insects, and it's a very tropical area. Like we have jungles there. So her for her that was a horrible time. And so when I was born, she kind of made it a goal of hers to make sure I wasn't afraid of bugs. So all my life, like starting from like the bedtime stories that I would have, like a lot of them were surrounding insects or would have insects as characters. And the idea was just I she wanted to make sure that I was someone who was exposed to it enough where I wouldn't be afraid.
Sure.
And that ended up backfiring because then I was really into bugs all the way like from when I was a kid. And I've kind of kept like every a group of species. So like before ants, I had like you'd walk into the house and find like 100 butterflies in like the living room or something. Um, and the ants just kind of came as like, oh, like I wonder if you could keep them. And that's really how I started keeping ants. And then Canada Ant Colony specifically would have been was just I didn't have an allowance, but I did have a lot of ants. So kind of it was a very organic way where I initially was just kind of trading around just to get the supplies that I needed, and then I had more than I needed. Things kind of, I would say, like grew pretty naturally from there.
Sure. That's awesome. That's a very similar story to how I have it. That's cool though. So that kind of makes sense why you're studying biology then as opposed to myrmecology, as you have more of an interest in the broader sense of insects. Is that something that's correct?
I think a little bit, but more so, I feel like um, I'm the type of person I want to do a lot, just in general. And I feel like to some extent, studying pharmacology would close a lot of doors that I think otherwise are really interesting. Like I think that,
Sure.
the other thing is that at least here in Canada, and I would guess most places, that there aren't like specified pharmacology programs.
Yep.
Um, and even if there were, I've probably okay, how to put this? I would say that I've probably learned enough information where I'm not even sure that taking those courses would be worthwhile. Not that I wouldn't learn anything. It's just that there's so much overlap with what I do already. Like most people who are taking that, who are directly jumping there, um, I'm gonna say like probably have a little bit less background, and especially if I'm not planning to do like entomology for the rest of my life. I'm happy with what I'm working with right now and the rate at which I'm learning.
Sure. That's awesome. Let's see here. Yeah, kind of going into this, I want to sort of explore like Canada Ant Colony, the beginning of that as your business. I know you mentioned, for example, that it started out of you not having a lot of money. Um, but like what sort of pushed you, say, as you grew up and you started seeing more money, what pushed you to continue the business to the point it is today, obviously being the most successful business for selling ants in Canada right now?
Um, I I don't think there was any big pushes for me. It was just um, more people needed ants, and uh, there and for me, it was like okay, like I'm going to figure out how to do that. For me, there was a point where, especially like after I graduated high school, so I started this like relatively early high school where I did think about um, kind of like letting it go and work on other things, just because I was going to move like 6 hours away, and
Sure.
that was going to make managing the business a lot more difficult. Uh, but I don't know. Ultimately, I had a lot of people who did work with me regularly, either as people who like sold me ants or people who bought ants, or just people that would talk to, like communities who like, hey, like who told me directly that they prefer if I at least try to keep it going. And so far, that's kind of how things have been. That makes
Sure.
sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's really interesting too. We'll get to this a little bit later, but I would love to cover the topic of running a Canada Ant Colony or a business in general while you're in college. So tell me how that goes when you're gone, 6 hours away for three-fourths of the year. Do you have employees or people that you hire?
Yeah, so first of all, I do want to give a lot of credit to my family. So they've helped me a lot, especially uh, in this especially in like more transitional zones. So for example, like right at the beginning of the move when I wasn't able to kind of do anything and I hadn't gotten this I guess the setup to like hire staff yet at the time. Like my family, especially my mom, was helping me like feed ants now and then. And afterwards currently we were moved into a full warehouse, and we have two warehouse staff that come in regularly to feed and pack ants. We also have another system that we've been working just only very recently, so we only have a couple species that are sold like this. But generally speaking, I think there's a big difference of transitioning between, let's say, like what I was doing before. So basically, a one man show. I think a lot of the businesses in the states, or actually no, I think a lot of the business that are ant keeping related in general, most of them are like this. Where it's one person, they're really knowledgeable about ants,
Hmm.
and they're kind of literally running the entire show. They're shipping everything out. They're feeding everything. Um, they're even going and collecting. Although that's I would say that's probably the first thing to leave.
Hmm.
For us, as we kind of went bigger, one thing that I had to do was to basically reduce most of our stock of a lot of the more specialty species or a lot of the stuff that's like hard to rear. Because, for example, I trust myself to be able to rear, let's say, like slave raider colonies or
Hmm.
colonies of like parasitic glacius. But that's not something that I would really push on to like most of my employees. So
Hmm.
these are generally people that are, let's say they have a background in, as in like they've kept a bunch of pets before, even like invertebrates and reptiles. But generally, like being good at bugs or being good at animals doesn't necessarily translate well to like these like very like specific species. Or some of them are just really time consuming, like stuff like stigmatoma, so like vampire ants, where they have a very picky diet, and if they don't have that diet, then it's a lot more difficult. I guess if you're hired staff to just go, okay, they're missing centipedes. Let me take an hour out of work and go and collect centipedes. It just doesn't work that way. And then
Hmm.
so I would say the other part of our business right now that's kind of more expanding or more testing out with is just we have a couple partners that kind of sit around where for a lot of these more specialized species, it's someone who's like very experienced who raises them, and then when a customer makes an order, it ships directly from that partner straight to the customer.
Sure.
At
That's
least almost
awesome.
for difficult species like that.
Mhm. And that's awesome as somebody who's tried their hand in both parasitic glacius and formiga. I mean, yeah, to be able to raise those is not something that's easy or for some you just to give a task to somebody. And I also like that idea of like broadening your horizons. I think you're probably on the leading edge of companies doing kind of like the drop shipping idea of a centralized website, but having other people actually care for the products. I think that's really awesome.
I think that there's a lot of limits to it, but I guess fundamentally, and this is more of like at scale, but a lot of ant species just aren't particularly like profitable to raise in house.
Hmm.
So for example, stuff like I mentioned before, like parasitic glacius, even if raised well, like they don't have very consistent like founding rates. So let's say you might have one batch that where 50% of them do well, and you might have another batch where 5% of them do well.
Hmm.
And and especially these fragile species where um, if I'm paying someone else to get a bunch of colonies, that chances are most of them will die, or most of them will
Hmm.
like not lay eggs or something, right? Um, it's just not something that's I guess worth keeping it. It's not something that's worth kind of eating all the cost for, especially like if I'm paying every single time that like someone feeds each colony.
Mhm. That's really interesting to me because I maybe there's a distinction here between Canada and the US, and I guess I haven't had enough experience talking to other vendors before, but it would seem to me in the United States that uh, parasitic Lasius, at least the one time they went for sale on Stateside Ants, sold out almost immediately. So I'm surprised that um, even if there's so many colonies of yours that don't make it, that the profit margins won't be high enough and the demand high enough that you would sell enough to make your money's back on that.
One thing that I do want to be clear, and I'm not going to speak for Anthony, but to my knowledge, Lasius parasites for him are more of like a personal passion project than it is something that he's like doing on a very large commercial scale. Because the other thing is that most people, and okay, this is more for me, and I know now more for stateside ants as well, but also a lot of other companies is that most of the people that are going to be buying ants are going to be beginners, and most of those people even if they sorry and most of those people even if they want to keep like parasitic lasius should not do it as their first ant. And then so not only like I'm also actively discouraging sales for like a solid chunk of our customers for a lot of the ants like this, because the idea is that let's say they take parasitic lasius as their first uh, species, and some people who have insisted like all right, we'll just let them, but chances are if it doesn't do well, which most likely is going to be the case, it's generally like a really discouraging experience for them. So we generally try to push people into the most guaranteed good ant keeping experience. So generally those are like the most beginner species like Lasius, like Tetramorium, like Camponotus. And if they do well then, and then they want to explore like some of the more difficult species, then they're free to and be encouraged that.
Sure.
But the other thing is that I would say that the number of even for like a company like Stateside Ants, I would say the number of parasitic Lasius that they sell is like dwarfed by the number of let's say like fully claustral Lasius that they sell, even though parasitic Lasius fly in like equal or greater numbers sometimes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that insight. Let's see. We talked a little bit about college, and your degree is biology. So that's awesome. Actually, this is a new thing for me. I thought you were going from ecology. I kind of want to talk about. I suppose in my discussion with you, it's slightly different than I initially anticipated in this question. But um, I suppose the correct way to word this is how much did Canada Ant Colony, sorry, or ant keeping in general play into you getting a biology degree? In the sense of, do you think if you didn't start Canada Ant Colony that you wouldn't have gotten that degree?
Let me think about that for a sec. Okay, so I think it's a little bit hard to answer, and the reason is because I decided to pursue biology for two reasons. The first one is because I think it's still a topic that's relatively, let's say, like academically rigorous. I wanted something that would continue. I wanted something that would continue to challenge me. Um, and so, for example, like another one I considered was like engineering, just like straight into engineering. But I ultimately chose biology because it's something that I enjoy a lot already, and because of my exposure to like the biological sciences generally. And the thing is, that's not only through Canada Ant Colony, but I would say that Canada Ant Colony by far and away has been my biggest influence in that.
Mhm.
And the thing is, if I didn't run the business, though, I probably would have found some other way to get involved um, in what the in the biological sciences.
Oh yeah,
So I would say it played a really big role, but it doesn't mean that it was necessarily the factor that pushed me here.
absolutely. I suppose this question somewhat applies to you. You mentioned it wasn't the only factor or the main factor, but you're kind of part of a new trend in the ant keeping world. I feel at least. This may not be fully true. I'm not the most experienced on this, but of younger people who have started keeping ants when they're really young, and then started a business, and then after their business, sort of gone to college or something. At least somewhat similar to what they want to do with their business. You take Luke from Buckeye, or I'm sure there's other examples of people that have done this. And my question is, um, what's the best way to put this? Do you see, with you going into biology, do you see Canada Ant Colony as a lifelong pursuit for you, or something that you'll continue to be a part of, but just maybe marginally less once you get into maybe a little more of the rigorous academic world, as you mentioned?
So that's a very complex question. Well, it's a question without a simple answer. So I'm gonna say that Canada Ant Colony is still within my 5-year plans in terms of, again, let's say in a few years I'm still gonna be here. But whether or not that might extend to like 10 or 15 years, that's something I'm a lot less certain of.
Sure.
Um, so the main thing here is that I think in terms of when I'm considering things like a career, uh, there's a pretty low ceiling on a lot of biology in general, and or okay, that's not true, on academia and on things that are related to entomology in general, other than killing bugs. Um, so right now, I am working on a couple products, so a couple formicaria and like starter kits that I think are going to be that I hope are going to be very impactful. But and these are in collaboration with a lot of the other, let's say, ant sellers throughout North America. And what my future looks like in terms of the ant keeping business is very contingent on what that looks like, on the success of those products. And
Awesome.
and,
That
and, and the, and the only reason is just because I think there is a point um, where unless do something big with it, I it does kind of push you to stagnate a little bit just because it's a low ceiling. There's only so many people that are looking to start a colony.
sure. Thank you. That was a complex and somewhat loaded question. You answered that well. Um, with that idea, I guess, of a low ceiling, something that I have not necessarily noticed in North America, but I have a guess that it may be the case, but I may be wrong. I want to ask you, in Canada, have you seen a continuous demand for ants? Have you seen a steady increase, decrease? How has that been going?
For me, it's been we're at the rate where we're a little bit plateauing. So we're still growing, but relatively slowly.
Mm,
Um, but I would say that there's a mix of reasons. So firstly, I think that just generally people now don't have as much money to spend as they did, for example, like during the pandemic. Like during the
yep,
pandemic, things were exploding. And
absolutely.
I think most people will echo the same feeling. The other thing is that we're starting to have more competitors here in Canada. Although that's changed a little bit recently with people like, oh, where the hobby is developed enough for a lot of people are saying like, oh, this is something that's interesting, and we're getting kind of secondary waves of people who um, are starting to sell ants.
Mhm.
But a third reason is because I think over here we're a lot more like ant keeping has penetrated a lot more than in the States. Um, so for example, we sell to maybe like a dozen pet store locations.
Interesting.
Um, pardon?
Oh, I said
Yeah,
interesting.
so
That's awesome. Yeah.
we sell to maybe like a dozen pet store locations. Um, we probably have we have less orders now than stateside ants, but we're still well above half their capacity, probably even like to three quarters.
Mhm.
And we're working with a population 10% the size, and so whatever equal. And so I'll give you a number, for example. We might deal with somewhere between 30 and 50 orders a week,
Wow.
and that's like to shipping.
Wow.
And so an equivalent in the States would have to be something like 300 to 500 orders a week. And that's, yeah. and that's before including like pet stores. That's including like we sell to research institutions as well. So
Hmm.
universities that need ants as subjects, they'll come to us generally. Um, and there's like a huge variety of other stuff. Like we'll have films or like documentary teams that'll come to us for ants. Um, and I would say that those aren't nearly as I'm gonna say like exploited in the States as they are here right now.
Hmm. Absolutely. That is really cool to hear. I love that branching out. I think that's really awesome. Um, Sort of going into that idea. I mean, obviously you mentioned maybe not as many queens that you keep as stateside ants, but tell me, you certainly keep a lot. What do you do to keep your colonies healthy and thriving?
For us, the two biggest things have just been making sure they have always have water, making sure the entire space is heated. We have two space heaters that kind of make sure the entire space is always at a 26 degrees 26 degrees Celsius. And all the ants have feeders all the time. And the idea is that they're never going to run out of sugar. We try to give them protein around twice a week, but it does depend on species. So some species we're going to feed them more often, other species we're going to feed them less.
Mhm.
But a lot of it has been, and this is more of like on a business side of things. A lot of it has more been um, trying to feed the ants in a diverse way uh, that for them lasts as long as possible. So I'll give you an example. A lot of our seed-eating species, so that looks like Pogonomyrmex, that looks like Tetramorium, even Phytoli, we've transferred over to like let's say like a 50% seed diet.
Mhm.
Where generally that means we're putting less maintenance per colony, but they're still growing relatively fast. Um, Same thing with for food now. We are cycling not just between insects, but also with like cooked chicken, cooked shrimp, even eggs. And the colonies seem to enjoy it in terms of uh, they have a lot more like diversity of food and in terms of what they can choose from. But a lot of them, especially compared to things like crickets, are also foods that rot a lot slower and
Yep.
don't smell as bad. But generally speaking, we're moving as much as we can towards feeding them things that people are generally okay with. Because if if staff are comfortable like taking care of the ants, they're going to do it more often.
Hmm.
One last thing, and this has been so, and this has been like a relatively new issue. I guess there's two things that are relatively new issues. So we use test tube outworlds, so we keep most of our ants in tubs and tube setups, with the exception of a few species that we're trying to breed. Um, but only recently have we started hitting kind of the size limits where the main reason the colonies stop growing is just because they literally don't have like enough space to significantly expand. That's still an issue we're trying to figure out right now. And I'm not sure how much I want to kind of push that up because I notice at least that colonies that are too big generally get less and less sales. So it's easier to sell a colony that's like 50 workers than it is to sell a colony that's like 500 workers. And
Hmm.
that's even if they're like similarly priced.
Hmm.
Um, so that's I guess a dilemma I'm looking at right now in terms of how much do I want to let the colonies grow. Um, One of the other ones is because we keep so many colonies, so we probably go through a couple thousand colonies a year. We're trying to actually shrink that number a little bit and just focus on a smaller number and making sure we have higher success rates for everything.
Hmm.
But there are there's definitely been times where we've had like I guess disease basically where we'll have like a large batch of queens they come in and most of them don't do well. And sometimes that looks like fungal parasites. Oh, sorry, sometimes that looks like fungal infections. Sometimes that looks like it's just unlucky where you get a lot of parasitic flies, where by the time the queens get to us, there's nothing we can do. And one thing I've been experimenting with is working with different like compounds that the ants can use as medicine, but it's still something that's like very, I'm gonna say experimental, and it's not something that I have necessarily like strong results on yet. But for one thing that, for example, has seemed to help is when we notice some level of like when we start seeing like ants that are dying and they're like molding over right away. Firstly, like we'll we'll stretch out the containers, um, but also now we're fully sanitizing every single feeder, every single container in between uses, or whenever something dies of like unnatural cause in them. Um, and for example, we're mixing um, a small amount of hydrogen peroxide in with some of the sugar feeders. And what that seems to do is there was a paper a couple of years ago where ants that have certain types of fungal infections will actually drink small amounts of peroxide. And in the wild, that comes from like different types of nectar, and but in captivity, even they were drinking hydrogen peroxide straight. And it seems to reduce the death rate of sick ants. And so we've been trying a lot of things, but it's mostly stuff that's experimental, and unfortunately, it's not stuff that I have very strong data on just yet.
Mhm. Oh, you absolutely jumped ahead there. That was one of the questions I was going to ask, but I guess I'll read my blurb here quickly. I do have a paired question with the ant medicine. Yeah, you recently, maybe not recently, but about maybe a little over a year ago, made a post on formiculture. That's how I became aware of your medicine experiments with ants, which I found very fascinating, by the way. A very well written article, so props to you for that. Um, in it, I guess, quickly as an introduction to people who haven't read that yet, you talk about SQD or sudden queen death, which I found very insightful, especially considering I had two colonies that died that way this year. Um, but my main question, besides, how is that project going, which you kind of answered, is uh, when or can consumers ever expect products from you concerning ant medicine?
I think it's going to be a while.
Mm,
Main reason is because, um, like, if this was something that was happening, let's say a couple of years ago when I was still the person taking care of most of the ants, it'd be something that you might see advance relatively quickly. But because now it's something where any of the experiments are based have to be run through my staff, and sometimes with staff turnover, or where people quit or people have to like change jobs for like different reasons. Um, Having very long-term experiments isn't nearly as doable as it was before. You have someone who's been working in for a while, and it's a project that I'm hoping on kind of pushing towards them because they have expressed like academic interest in ants before, and they've wanted something that would kind of help them in that aspect.
yeah.
But generally speaking, there are some practices that we started way back when, and they seem to be effective, although we don't know how much. So we continue using them, and we are not very thorough in evaluating the effectiveness, although that's something we're looking to do in the future.
Awesome, awesome. I think that that is a very unexplored sector of ant keeping. Um, I guess jumping back to the amount of queens you keep, I do want to ask a little bit more specific. You mentioned liquid feeders, obviously keeping ants fed and watered at all times. Is there any other specific products you promote? I know you sell Sunburst on your site, so that might be something. And then, secondly, have you ever used agar agar solution or mixes for your ants?
Can you tell me what you mean by like products that I promote?
Or I believe on your website you sell Sunburst ant nectar, correct?
Okay, I see, I see.
I just want
Well,
to
we
know
sell
like
mixed.
if you use those for your ants and if those are like effective, I guess.
Gotcha, that makes sense. So Sunburst and Nectar is something that I definitely stick to. I don't use it for all of my colonies. Basically, for us, we'll use them for important colonies or colonies that are particularly fragile. So, for example, right now we're trying to breed black crazy ants, Paratrechina longicornis. They're a species that's legal to get in Canada, but uh, unfortunately is incredibly difficult to ship, and they're very, very picky. So for example, they are, for example, on uh, sunburst ant nectar, or other species like Myrmecocystis. Uh, those are on sunburst nectar. But for most of our colonies, they're on a sugar mix that's been adapted over the years to try to get a as close and as good of a result as we can get. Another reason that we use our own mix for a lot of our, I'm gonna say like more simple species is like I mentioned before, especially for things like Lasius or Tetramorium, a lot of the times they reach like a maximum very quickly based on the size. So let's say
Mm.
that once the colony's at around like 150 workers, no matter what we feed them, they're gonna stay the same size because we just don't have the space to give them to put them in something where they get to 500 workers, and we're not sure if they would sell at 500 workers. Um, so what we're doing a dyed salt and sugar mix for those. And the reason for the food dye is because we're able to track basically when each colony was fed. So for example, cycle between like a purple dye, blue dye, red dye, green dye, and then
Hmm.
so if it's there's like a schedule. So okay, this most recent batch of feeders we used a purple sugar water. That means that uh, the ones with purple feeders are, let's say, have been fed 1 week ago, and the ones with red feeders were fed 2 weeks ago, and blue feeders were 3 weeks ago. And it also means that I mentioned before where some of our species we give them, or sorry, some colonies when they seem sick, we'll give them a small like hydrogen peroxide and sugar water feeder.
Hmm.
That is also dyed its own color. It's dyed like a turquoise, where it's easy to identify and you won't mix them up. So,
Sweet. And my other question was agar-agar mixes. I've read several scientific articles about, I believe it was like Whitcomb was one of them, and some recent articles on that. I don't know if you would try that at all. I was just out of personal interest, something that I was intrigued in doing recently and wanted to know your experience.
no worries. So the lab I work in uses Badker Whitcomb diet, or as we call it, yellow diet. Um, it's not something that I personally believe in. And the reason is because if you read the initial studies that uh, where they developed this mix, they basically only tried on two species, and those two species are Solenopsis invicta and Campnotus floridanus. And if you've kept or worked with either of those species,
Mhm.
I've even heard about them. They're basically species that eat anything. So for me, having those species grow consistently well doesn't mean that much to me. The other thing is that they weren't getting good results until they were supplementing the yellow diet with I think it was like beef heart and like insects,
Yep, the study that I had cockroaches. Yep.
cockroaches. And then so from my perspective, um, it might work as a filler diet, right? If that makes sense.
Hmm.
But I personally don't see that much of a point, especially because it's not that much cheaper than just feeding them. For example, like I mentioned before, like chicken is
Hmm.
probably no chicken is cheaper. Sorry, what am I saying?
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was good. And so I've also considered chicken before too, but I know Lasius love it, so I will have to use that more in the future. So thank you for that. Let's get a little more broad, I suppose. You mentioned a lot of ant keepers who buy from Canada Ant Colony are new ant keepers. Um, and so this question kind of is directed towards them. But what is your most selling, or what are a few of your most selling ant colonies at Canada Ant Colony?
Uh, there's four of them. There's, and this is in order. I would say Campnotus castaneus, uh, Petromorium immigrans, Camponotus herculeanus, and then Lasius neoniger. Uh, the first one, Campnotus castaneus, because those we bring those to shows very often. They're a big flashy ant, and
Hmm.
uh, people generally, as soon as they see them, they're like, yeah, they understand the price tag. And they're a good beginner species. The other three are the species that we sell relatively cheaply. So I think that, for example, a Camponotus queen from us for Herculanus generally runs the equivalent of around like 15 US dollars, and then the other two around 10 US dollars. Um, and it gets higher with larger colonies, and that's just because they're relatively cheap and easy species.
Yeah, awesome.
Although I
I
will
think
say
that's
that
or
for
go ahead.
those, the customer base is a lot more online than in person.
Hmm, yeah, understandable. I know Cassininas are probably the most highest selling in the US too, as well as my guess. Um, hmm. I find that interesting that Herculean is such a high seller for you because I actually just caught a few queens a couple weeks ago, which is really exciting for me. It was a new species I'd never caught, and it has, to at least the best of my knowledge, not been sold in the US before. So I find that really interesting. That's one of your highest sellers.
So there's a pretty good reason for that. It's because Camponotus herculeanus is by far the most common in boreal forest. And when you look at just like the habitat distribution of boreal forest, there's tons and tons and tons of it in Canada, and then it gets just a little bit into the states. Or
Mhm,
okay, and then it's scattered patches all over the states. So that means that for us collecting Camponotus herculeanus on a in a good spot, you can reasonably collect 600 or 700 in an evening.
mhm.
Um, and that's something that like that type of habitat just doesn't really exist in the states other than maybe like northern Minnesota, for example.
Mhm.
The other thing is
Yeah.
because uh, they are not nearly as widespread in the states as they are here in Canada. Here, they're in every single province, every single territory. And in the states, it's only the northern few, and not even on. It's only the north and central states.
Mhm. Awesome. Let's see here. All right. You'll know this question. I messaged you about it slightly about it recently. You have by far the best collection of Formica for sale in the Western Hemisphere. It is absolutely awesome. I'm incredibly jealous. I'm a huge Formica lover. Um, my question is, how do Canadians react to your stock? Because I've noticed there are some species that you seem to have in stock a lot that at least I believe, and I know I would personally buy them out immediately, like Formica Bradley. So how do Canadians react to your Formica selections?
I think Formica is actually probably one of the groups of ants we sell less. But I'm looking to change that. So, like I mentioned before, most of our customer base are beginners, and I would say that generally speaking, we try to push beginners away from Formica a little bit more than they do the other species. And the reason is just because Formica they have this one tendency where uh, as long as they have heat, as long as they have food, they're gonna grow. And the moment they'll go a single day without it, and then they're gonna stop until the next one, until like they
Mhm.
hibernate. Or a lot of times they'll stop mid-season for no reason, and if they're not in very good conditions, they're not really gonna try to resume. Um,
Wow, that is
so,
really insightful, actually.
so generally speaking, Formica for us is we'll have a lot of it's a really they're a really cool group of ants. Um, but it's also one where generally speaking we're like very quick to hibernate them as soon as they stop, and one where generally we're not pushing a lot of people to come and buy them. One thing that has changed is the system I mentioned before, where we have a couple folks who are kind of specifically keeping, especially Formica is one of the species. Um, People who are specifically keeping a couple of species and shipping directly out from them, where it's purchased on our website. But one more big insight, and this is something that you're probably not expecting, is that Formica for our employees is probably the worst ant to care for.
Hmm.
The reason is because we basically rows of hundreds and hundreds of like little outworlds, and Formica run really, really fast. And they're also the type where stuff like Camponotus, they're timid enough where they can run fast, but they're running fast away from the lid. Whereas
Mhm.
stuff like Formica, they're basically jumping out. Uh, and that means that a lot of times, if we are bringing in Formica colonies, even if we try our best, a lot of times they're not getting as good care as they could. And so we've thought about things like um, getting uh, like entirely different setups just for Formica or using like larger containers. But then it becomes the issue where if I can keep one Formica colony or in the equivalent amount of space, 12 Camponotus colonies,
Hmm.
then it becomes more and more difficult to justify keeping Formica. And so giving them a place has been something I've been looking to do, and that's why this year you're seeing a lot more of like the parasitic species and some of the more finicky ones, and it's because um, we found a person who's able to do that. One thing that's really nice about Formica, and I think I'm going to say this about a lot of northern species that I think is very underrated, is that northern species, so this is especially stuff like Formica neorufibarbis, even to some extent like Formica lacioides. This is, um, and then a lot of the ones you'll see in the Midwest is that they are number one easy to trigger flights with, where the biggest thing is just humidity and sunlight, like
Hmm.
sunlight. And the other thing is that they take queens back. And so one project we've been kind of working on is having captive bred Formica for some of these species. So I know Formica neorufibarbis breeds incredibly well. And literally for us, the main breeding trigger has just been we'll grab a big container, we'll like stick them out in the sunlight, we'll like cover them with a big piece of mesh, and they just start they'll mate, and then the colony takes the queens back. So
Hmm.
we're,
Yeah,
we're
fascinating.
trying to work more species.
And I will definitely be getting that, getting a question uh, for you for that in the future. Definitely right here on my list. Well, funny I said that. That's actually the next thing that I have here. I have a slight blurb for that, if you'll honor me in reading that
No
quickly.
worries.
A few years ago, you announced on Formiculture, here's where I get a lot of my information because that's where I'm on most often, that all of your colonies of Aphenogaster rudis, Pichia, and tennesseeensis were captive bred. Uh, I believe that's still the case, probably.
So it's less okay. It is the case, but in a way that you might not be expecting. So the first thing is generally we currently don't sell Aphenogaster rudis. Aphenogaster piscia we still do a little bit. Aphenogaster occidentalis, which currently is not captive bred, but we're looking to move in that direction, is currently basically the main Aphenogaster we sell on our site.
Hmm.
Uh, Even stuff like I believe it's currently labeled as Picea because we do have a lot of Picea in that mix as well, but the main one is Aphenogaster occidentalis. And the reason is because so far we've had a little bit more difficulty with rearing them. But one thing that's interesting is that for a lot of ant species, there are populations where if they become isolated for long enough, they start being a little bit super colonial, where because they're all related, they'll take queens back all the time. And we have populations of Aphenogaster occidentalis where colonies are getting to hundreds of queens and tens of thousands of workers. And so
Wow.
that's been our main focus for Aphenogaster currently. And then the idea is that if we can read those in the same way that as we were Mycia and Rudis, it would be a really big deal because it's an ant that people want a lot more. They're almost identical to the median ant keeper, but
Hmm.
the fact that they're able to make these colonies and merge together is like it is a really big plus, especially
Oh
because
yeah.
that means that instead of having 10 medium-sized Aphenogaster colonies that are breeding for us, that looks like having one mega colony where we just throw stuff in a bin and they do their own,
Hmm.
and they do their own stuff. As for Aphenogaster tennessensis, that species is still entirely captive bred right now, um, and it's been very interesting because right now we're consistently able to get several, almost 100 every single year just from the breeding. Um, I would say it's a success, but on the other hand, it's also a species which is, I would say, just difficult enough where we're not really pushing it out as much as we could be, even, and I think rightfully so.
Hmm. It's a parasite. Of course, it's going to be difficult. Um,
Well, one thing we've gone, well, one thing that has helped that a lot for us is now Aphaenogaster tennescensis. We basically rear them exclusively with tennescensis workers, and the reason is just because we have enough colonies in captivity where they're able to. So we have enough colonies in captivity where we're able to just throw them with 20 tennescensis workers and then push them forward. And that removes most of the issues for the parasites. The main issue with the Aphaenogaster tennescensis is that they have nearly non-existent social stomachs. And that means that um, this is especially an issue um, for us where we're keeping a huge volume of ants, is that if they miss one feeding, you're losing like half the workforce because they can't store food unlike a lot of other ants. So that's a species that we're moving onto the list, which is mainly like fulfilled by a partner, mainly for that reason.
mhm.
But they're still very consistently available, and we always have colonies now that both have biological workers and colonies with host workers, which are also tenant census.
That is wonderful. So I guess yeah, the main question that I had here, I think it's awesome that you're breeding ants. I think that's a great step forward for anting as a whole. My double question is, was there research that you built on that had been previously done for raising queens that helped you get to the point where you are today? And what's the ideas going forward with that project?
Can you tell me more by what you mean by raising queens?
Yeah, I mean, like, is there a scientific precedent set for that? Has there been any journals or studies done by scientists on breeding within ants, or is this something that you've just completely done on your own?
I think for the most species, what we do is that we'll sometimes there will be uh, scientific scientific documentation of other nuptial flights look in the wild. Sometimes, on occasion, we'll get reports for like breeding in captivity, and that's helped for certain species. But for most of the time, it's actually the other way around, where we actually have researchers that come to us and ask for insights into um, having ants produce new queens in captivity. So not sorry, not producing new queens in captivity, and having queens that have already been produced in captivity start to mate. Um, one I would say the best example on the other side is probably Formica yulkii. So it's a really cool parasitic species. And there's a there's a paper somewhere where were they were rearing elates and they had mixed the elates of a lot of different colonies together and um, just keeping them in a normal setup like that, they actually started to mate in captivity, and that's something that we've tried to recreate a few times, and I know is consistently recreatable. Um, it's just not a species we've been working with it as intently. And I would say that a lot of my knowledge for Formica specifically comes from a friend. His name is Dominic Ouellette. He's a myrmecologist here in Quebec, and he's done a lot of playing around with um, what flights look like in those species. Although it's generally unpublished, it's stuff that sometimes we'll go out, we'll collect ants, and then we'll just talk about it. But it's also but we've also had a lot of situations where it's the other way around. So stuff like a Phytogaster, we've had folks come to us. Stuff like some of the Formica, some of the Tapenoma, Stigmatoma, we've had folks come to us, um, including in like the scientific field.
Hmm.
And generally, what it seems to be, um, or just as a hint generally for anyone who's listening to this, but a lot of ants seem to have like strong lighting cues that will push them to like certain mating behaviors, and whether that's swarming, whether that's flying, whether that's mating, a lot of times those happen separately. Um, so it's a bit more complex than oh, give them light, they fly. Uh, but I think that's where most of it's probably headed towards.
And for the future, do you see yourself heading to a place where most of the species that you sell in your store are captive bred, or do you think that's not feasible in the next, say, 5 years?
That's a really good question. I think it's feasible reasonably from like a scientific perspective, but not necessarily from actually, no, sorry. I would say for a lot of species, it's feasible from a scientific perspective, but unfortunately for especially some of our better selling species, so especially Camponotus and Lasius, I doubt that's going to be the case. And this is both from a scientific perspective, but also an economic perspective. So, for example, Lasius we collect in huge numbers. Um, I'll recruit people who are paid hourly to collect Lasius during their flights, and we have like a huge number of collectors because they fly everywhere. So Lasius right now we're paying basically a dollar or the equivalent of 75 US dollar, like sorry, 75 US cents per queen, where reasonably speaking, I'm not even convinced that, let's say that we were breeding Lasius colonies in mass, that would be significantly cheaper or even significantly more consistent than just catching the huge flight every year.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, the other one is stuff like Camponotus, where I've never been able to get them to mate in captivity consistently. I've been able to get a lot of those species to fly in captivity or initiate a nuptial flight. But it seems to be the case that they'll do this like aerial lek, where they kind of mate in this swarm in the air and then fall down afterwards. And I don't think that's reasonable to do, at least with my current facilities. And even if it were, it would be again for stuff like Herculeus, it'd be very difficult to justify um, rearing large colonies to breed them when we could collect 600 in an evening.
Yeah, absolutely. They Glacius definitely have big flights, that is for certain. Well, I got a few more questions. I don't want to be taking more of your time than I need to be, and I know you said you had a little bit of a difficult time, and you're currently in the middle of an experiment. So two more questions. Firstly, you announced the Down the Anthill line of Outworlds about a year ago. So beautiful Outworlds. For anybody that doesn't know, I'll probably have a picture up. But tell me how that's going.
Those have been doing great. They've replaced the vast majority of our Outworld line. Right now, we do get reports of a couple issues where um, sometimes people will report escapes for like nanitics of smaller species. So that's stuff like Nalandria, that's stuff like Fatally Bicarinata. So that's something we're working on fixing. We're working with stateside analysts currently. We're probably going to be releasing a ventless version soon. So something that's specifically for species that would otherwise be difficult to contain. Um, but at least over here in Canada, they've basically replaced they've replaced most of our outward line, and the reason is um, they're so much better than what we were using previously. So most of the containers on the market right now, so this is including like Pioneer Plastics, this is including AMAC, they're made of polystyrene. So it's the same material as um, styrofoam, and and there's a lot of benefits there. Namely, that it's really clear, it's really pretty, it's very cheap, um, but it's very easy to scratch. And then so you'll notice that most of those containers, generally after a year or two, you'll see visible scratches everywhere. Um, for this, we kind of went. Oh, and the other issue is that for us, because in Canada, we were having to import stuff like Pioneer Plastics across the border, and so we would get maybe 10% of them broken, or like 10 to 15% of them broken on arrival.
Wow.
Um, and then additional like whatever percent, where it's like we send them to a customer, and then the post office like kicks them or something, and there's like a chip on the corner, or there's a crack in a hole where it shouldn't be. So we've generally replaced all of our all of our outworlds with acrylic, and the ones we were and the down the anthill outworlds generally don't scratch, and you can throw one at a wall and it'll still be fine. So a lot of it has been because the quality of the outworld is better. A lot of it is also because It's just easier to ship with. So one thing we'll do now is that we'll package the Outworld and then we'll put half of the order into the Outworld because we can guarantee that that's everything in the Outworld is gonna arrive safe and the Outworld's gonna be fine too.
That's awesome to hear. I was very excited when you announced those. They look beautiful. They had the meshing that increases the ventilation, which a lot of the um, like you mentioned, Pioneer plastic ones don't. And that's a lot more difficult to get. So I think that's an awesome innovation there. Finally, I want to ask you an interesting question. I know you mentioned earlier on about competition increasing. Um, I believe, and I'm not sure if this is completely still the case, but you live, or not you live, I guess the company is located very close to Porrimore Art, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's really cool that you guys are really close to, what would be considered a big competitor, but it seems like you guys are really close. So tell me about that.
Yeah. I mean, Yaron have very different specialties. He's someone that has had a lot of experience in business, and he's someone that generally he's basically an engineer. He approaches this from a lot more of like an engineering standpoint. So, generally specialized in nests. I know he right now he's um pushing more so into spiders as well. Uh, whereas on our end, at least for now, our specialty has mostly been ants. So I would say that we're competitors, but it hasn't ever been something that's kind of gotten out of control. Um, I'll ask him questions pretty regularly about formicarium design, uh, or like manufacturing. He'll ask me questions about ants, and I haven't seen any big reason um, to damage that relationship, and I know that he values it as well. Um, yeah, I honestly don't have any big comments about it. He's just someone that to me is pretty chill. Um, and sometimes he helps me, sometimes I help him, and I enjoy our relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. My thought was, and I think that's really awesome to see. What in another business or another day might have been considered competitors or somebody who would you would be fully against coming together in your guys' specialties. I think that's awesome. I suppose the final thing that I would say is, what would you tell somebody who's interested in getting into ants, who's in Canada? What would be your first piece of advice that you tell them?
Let's see. I think my first piece of advice for people would probably just be to do research before you start. Um, one way that we've been approaching and keeping as a business is that most of it is a knowledge issue. So it's people ant keeping is easy, but it's different from a lot of other pets, and people don't necessarily know how to do it just off the top of their heads. That's fine. Um, there's a ton of species that there are, and people don't know what to pick, and we try our best to make those choices easy. So, for example, we push into like starter kits with ants already selected. But there's always people that um, I'm going to say don't do the research, and we try to mitigate that the best we can. So we have guides everywhere. We have probably over 50 on our website, including care sheets. Uh, most of our orders will send out with uh, like it's a it's like a mini care sheet. It's the size of a business card. Um, most of our kits also send out with like product instruction booklets. But we still definitely get occasionally, not occasionally. We still definitely get more than it should happen. I would say maybe on like every other week, where we'll get customers who are like, okay, like I want to know why my ants aren't eating. And we'll ask them what they're feeding them, and we'll be feeding them like tree leaves or something. Or it's like, oh, like my ants aren't growing. Like, can you help me? And almost 60% of the time, someone asks that, it's, oh, are you heating your ants? And it's like, oh, I didn't know you had to heat your ants. And it's like, okay, well, but I think that a lot of uh, what it is, well, what ant keeping is as as an industry, or what the role really should be, or what your job is kind of as a seller is to make sure that um, your customers are educated. We try our best to do that. We have several different phone numbers that people can call, and then people that represent us at shows. They also like take on and like and mentor like gatekeepers in their area. But it's ultimately something where like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your day to do this with me. And I thank you so much for all the insight and intellect you brought to this. And I appreciate it very, very much.
Just thank you so much for the conversation.